Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 8th UGLO Open University session, where we are discussing topics related to global health. In today's session, the focus will be on environmental determinants of health. Unfortunately, our lecturer, Professor Katja Radon from Ludwig Maximilians University, cannot be here with us today live. Therefore, you will be seeing a pre-recorded video. This obviously means that today we won't be holding a Q&A after the lecture. However, if you have any questions to our lecturer, feel free to add them to the comments and we will forward them to Professor Radon later on to answer. So without further ado, let's begin today's session and I hope you will enjoy it.
In households in which mercury was burned.
Since 2014 I am also chairwoman of the Center for International Health of this university. My focus is empowering health professionals in Latin America. Due to my interest for global health, I was invited to be the academic leader of EUGLOH at LMU. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Unfortunately, I do not have any superpower. But I am happy to explain you something about the global burden of disease and how it is studied. During the next hour we will learn why it might be useful to measure the global burden of disease, how it is measured in the Global Burden of Disease study, and finally, we will see some results and applications. Enjoy! Let's start.
Hello, welcome again to another session of the Szeged Open University. This session is based on a session held about 2 weeks ago on the global burden of disease. But it will be advanced beyond what you've learned during that earlier session. We will focus on one aspect of the determinants of health. Or putting it the other way around, determinants of the burden of disease, the environment. So let's start with thinking about what our environment is. So here a figure indicating the different layers of our environment. Looking at it, well, we may see in the outer layer that we are coming from different countries: Hungary, Portugal, France, Sweden, and Germany, and maybe even many more. But nevertheless, we share the global ecosystem, need to rely on climate stability and biodiversity. Within our countries, we have natural environment, air, water, and land. Our health and the health of the animals and plants depend on their cleanness. There's also the built environment, including buildings, places, and streets. By now, we know that our health might improve by the greenness of our cities, and I will talk about that at the end of my presentation. But also the local economy, social networking, and our lifestyle influence our health. For example, what we are eating. So our work environment, the balance between work, family, and other aspects, all this contributes to our health and to the well-being and health of our neighborhoods. But not only the health of us, our communities, people in our country, at our continent, and around the globe are interconnected. There is a strong relationship between human health and animal health. And you see this here behind me in the picture. And frequently, one other aspect is not taken into account, at least by us, the health scientists. This is the health of the environment itself. One simple example: if we reduce our forests Wild animals come closer to the built environment, to our villages and cities. Thereby, we come into contact with these animals and might be infected with zoonotic diseases. COVID-19 is just one example of this. The massive use of antibiotics and its consequences for human, animal, and environmental health is another example of this relationship, covered by the One Health approach. So without any further delay, how much is the impact of the environment on global health? Well, some of you may remember the lecture on global burden of disease and the international group we were meeting in this session. There we got to know the global burden of disease study, and that besides estimating the burden of premature death and disease to health, it also identifies how much of disease burden is attributable to specific factors. One group of such factors is the environment, including the occupational environment. Based on the estimates of this study, it was estimated for 2016, so 5 years ago, that 23% of global deaths are linked to the environment, which is about 13 million deaths a year. This is shown in the screenshot behind me, taken from a brochure by the WHO Environmental Health Group. So WHO stands for World Health Organization. The share of DALYs, you remember DALYs, disability adjusted years of life, is almost as huge, 22%. Remember that a disease frequently not only has one factor contributing to it, the one cause. Therefore, the risk factors do not add up to 100%. Please note that so far, climate change is only considered by consequences of high temperatures in these estimates. Other consequences of it are not yet taken into account. So as discussed last time, and there are also limitations to this estimate, but it's the best we have at the moment. When we ask where the environment causes most death, we find this information on the same WHO brochure. Most affected is the Southeast Asian and Western Pacific region, where also most people live on our planet. Followed is this by the African region. Europe ranks 5 with 1.5 million deaths a year attributable to the environment. In 2016, about 2/3 of deaths attributable to the environment were due to non-communicable diseases. Stroke and ischemic heart disease were the most prominent, with around 5 million deaths that year. But the list goes on with unintentional injuries ranking 3rd, cancers ranking 2 million, and chronic respiratory diseases on rank 5. When we have a closer look at the risk factors which contribute to DALYs, we see that air pollution, as one of the environmental risk factors, ranks 5 in the list of risk factors, with around 15% of DALYs attributed to it. Occupational risks are also an important risk factor, with many DALYs attributed to them. Their rank was 10, followed by unsafe water and sanitation, which still is a problem and might even be more a problem with the ongoing climate change. So in summary, the environment is an important contributor to the global burden of disease. This means if we improve the health of the environment, we will also improve human and animal health. While last time we carefully worked through how the global burden of disease is estimated, you might now be curious how the share of different factors on disease risks is analyzed. For this, scientific studies are used. An important part of evidence comes from epidemiological studies. Epidemiology investigates the distribution of diseases in different populations. By doing so, risk factors can be identified. How this is done, I will show you in the 3 examples from the work of my team. Let's start with an example on air pollution, as we just learned that air pollution is very important for the global burden of disease. For this, I would like to invite you to travel with me to the Chilean desert in South America. We will visit a town called Andacollo. So let's travel to Latin America. The town is small. The landscape is typical for the desert in the north of Chile. And another aspect is similar to many communities in the north of Chile. There is mining going on. Here you find an industrial copper mine, which is the mountain you see behind me, but also an industrial gold mine close to the community, which is not shown in this picture. And in the front, you see a part of Andacollo town. The mines are owned by North American enterprises. The mayor of the city is very happy that they own the mines, as they contributed a lot to the development of the town, he feels. For example, the pavement of the main roads was paid by these enterprises so that dust exposure could be reduced. Nevertheless, the community itself, and especially a group of activists in the community, is very concerned about potential health effects of the industrial mining very close to the town. Especially when the explosions are done, the dust exposure is very high. In addition, chemicals are used and enter air and water. They observed that many of the kids had breathing problems and also learning difficulties. That's why they contacted the local university. And this local university is one of our partner universities. So they invited us to visit the town and to think about what could be done about the problems the people here observed. Here you see the location of the industrial mines and the location of the community. You can see that the distance between the mines and the town is very small. The town is located just 1 to 5 kilometers from the 2 mines. When we were visiting the community, they showed us around, and in addition to the industrial mining, they were also showing us traditional mining, gold mining. Here in the picture, you see one of the so-called tapiches, where traditional workers mix the crushed stones with mercury to extract the gold. Here you see the sand, which is then after the crushing produced, and in the crushed stones, the sand, you might already see some shining, which could be gold. And then back home in their backyards, to which they also invited us, they burn the mixture. And then the mercury is evaporating to the air. And the resulting product you see here, it's pure gold. And as you may know, or almost pure gold at least, and as you may know, mercury exposure is associated with damage to brain. And when you talk to the workers, you already see that some of them have symptoms of chronic exposure to mercury. So therefore, together with the mayor of the city, the schools, and this very active community group, we decided to do a cross-sectional study in the 2 public schools of the community, aiming at studying the association between distance to the industrial mines and respiratory symptoms of the children, and mercury exposure and neuromotor skills of the same children. So for this, we need to know what is a cross-sectional study. Well, in a cross-sectional study, you include exposed and unexposed persons, which, well, if you take a community-based sample, you usually have exposed and unexposed children. For example, in this situation we face here in the town. And then, in our case, the school children are our exposed and unexposed persons. And then you detect, you measure how many of the exposed and how many of the unexposed children are ill. And then you compare the percentage of sick children in both groups. And this percentage is then called the prevalence. You compare the prevalences and come up with an odds ratio. So in the study called Caracolito, about 200 children took part. They all attended 2 of the public schools in the community. Their parents answered a questionnaire about respiratory symptoms. We obtained information about the location of the houses of the children. We measured mercury in their fingernails and did a test in which kids showed their neuromotor skills. Here you see a little bit of the test we were doing. You also measured their intelligence with a test. And then here you see one of the classrooms in which the measurements were done. So what were the first results? So for the first study question, the answer was kids with higher mercury exposure measured in the fingernails were kids whose favorite place of playing was the backyard, in households in which mercury was burned in the same backyard. So having the exposure in the backyard and playing there increased the exposure, at least in the fingernails. In the next step, we could also show that children living in households in which mercury was burned were more likely to have limited cross-motor skills. However, the average cross-motor skills in the community were overall poor, much lower than the reference population in Switzerland. So in order to find out whether this was a consequence of mining or health inequity, we repeated the neuromotor skill testing in a nearby city with children from public and private schools. Here we could show that children attending public schools had worse neuromotor skills than those from private schools. So here we had an indication of health inequity by social determinants of health, contributing, besides the environment, to the health of these children. For our second study question, whether the distance to the industrial mines influence has an association with respiratory health, we analyzed the distance of the children's home to the 2 industrial mines. Let's have a look at the figure behind me, in which the distance to the mines is shown on a logarithmic scale on the x-axis. The y-axis shows the odds ratio, a measure of risk comparing the prevalences in both groups. The odds ratio for the largest distance was set to 1. So if all children had the same chance of asthma in the upper panel, or respiratory allergy in the lower panel, the odds ratio would be 1 for all children. If the risk measured as odds, was increased, the odds ratios for children living closer to mines would be above 1. If it was smaller, the odds ratio would be below 1. Of course, we took other factors into account, like socioeconomic status of the parents. The area shaded in the figure in gray is the 95% confidence interval, giving some indication about the uncertainty of our estimates, assuming that there was a true effect. The figures on the left hand give the results for the gold mine, the figures in the middle for the copper mine, and to the right, the average distance to either mine is taken as exposure approximation. Overall, the figures indicate that the risk is getting lower with increasing distance, especially for symptoms of allergic rhinitis. For asthma, the trend was the same, but here we had lower numbers and this was limiting our statistical power. So in short, living closer to the industrial mines was associated with worse respiratory health of the children in these 2 public schools of the community. After the study, we communicated our results back to the community. Here, risk communication is one of the most important skills of the researcher. We managed that the parents listened and in the end started to discuss options to reduce mercury exposure for the children, like burning the mercury outside the town. This would not have reduced the exposure of the workers, but at least for the children. For this, community-based approaches are very useful, and over time we started such community-based intervention programs also in other communities in Latin America, who had other environmental health challenges. In addition, we started an intervention in the community of Andacollo to improve neuromotor skills among the children using simple physical exercises at the schools and also reporting results to politicians with the idea to offer more physical exercise at public schools to improve cross-motor skills, which were worse independently of the environmental exposure. And we also know that lack of exercise is a challenge to global health. It ranks 14 on the list of risk factors to the global burden of disease. So in summary of our first study design, this study gives us some insight on how different factors on health are interrelated. We had the industrial exposure, but also the small-scale exposure in the household. We showed the contribution of social factors working with a disadvantaged community, and we faced the challenge of a behavioral risk factor, lack of exercise. Other researchers have measured exposure of the environment in the community, and you might imagine that the environment is also affected by the pollution, as is animal health. Stakeholder involvement was crucial for the success of the studies, and interventions to me are important as improving health in the long run is what we are doing all this for. So with this, let's move to our second study and also second type of study designs. Radiation is an important contributor to human health. Just think about indoor radon exposure in some areas or the Fukushima nuclear disaster. But today I would like to talk about non-ionizing radiation. One of it is omnipresent today, mobile phone exposure. I'm pretty sure that you're all using mobile phones. As it's used so much, even a very small risk at the individual level would mean a huge effect on global health. And there are many people concerned about the potential health risks of mobile phone exposure, as there are for any new technology. As many children already use mobile phones early on in their life, the exposure could be especially relevant for their health later in life. Thinking again about the life course approach, which we will go into detail a little further in a minute. As at least in the traditional way of using mobile phones, exposure to the head occurs, the effect might also occur in the head. So the question whether mobile phone use is associated with brain tumors among children and young people was an important topic to the European Union. As brain cancers luckily are rare cancers, and even more in young people, an exposure might take a long time to have an effect. We need another design to study this study question. This design is called case-controlled study. Cases where children and teenagers with brain cancer, and controls comparable to the cases, but they should not suffer from brain cancer. In both groups, we then have to assess the exposure, in our case, mobile phone exposure. This is usually done by questionnaires or, if possible, by biomarkers which reflect past exposures. In the end, we then compare whether cases are more likely to be exposed than controls. So whether exposure occurs more frequently in the ill participants than in the healthy participants. So we had the pleasure being part of such a case-controlled study on mobile phone exposure and childhood brain tumors. It was funded within the 7th Framework Program 2007 to 2013. As childhood brain cancers are so rare, in addition to select the appropriate study design, we had to involve researchers from many countries. The study was coordinated by a team from Barcelona in Spain. You see that there were also study centers outside Europe involved. You can see that on the map. So, for example, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also other parts of Asia. They obtained funding from other funding agencies. In Germany, our task was to recruit 200 cases with brain tumors and 800 controls. So 4 controls for 1 case to maximize statistical power for the analysis. Controls in our study were children and adolescents who were hospitalized for an appendicitis. To reach the number, we in Germany alone had to collaborate with 45 clinics for case recruitment and with 59 hospitals for control recruitment. You may imagine that the coordination effort behind was huge. All cases and controls were interviewed and their parents too, to obtain a complete exposure history on mobile phone use and other potential exposures. Each interview took around 1 hour to complete, which is quite a long time, not only for the interviewers, but more than anything else, also for the cases who were severely sick in many cases. In order to reduce information bias, cases and controls could only be included if they were within a small time interval after the surgery or after the diagnosis. This way, the researchers were hoping that cases could remember well the time before the diagnosis. Further complicated was the fact that the cases were sometimes very sick or even died, and that of course then interviewing themselves or their parents was even more critical or not possible in case they died. And from an ethical point of view, it was frequently not possible also to interview the parents who suffered so much. So here a table of the number of potential cases and controls. And you can see that it was very hard to reach the number of cases and controls we were aiming at. Of the invited cases and eligible cases, 80% participated, which is quite good, and 60% among the controls. In Germany, of the 200 cases we were aiming at, we in the end could only include 91 cases, and of the 800 controls, only 124. Nevertheless, the final number of brain cancer cases in children and adolescents in this study was almost 900, which is behind what we were aiming at, but today the best study, the largest study, one or at least one of the largest studies on childhood brain tumors, which could be conducted so far. There was another challenge. Between proposal writing and carrying out the study, the use of mobile phones had reached almost 100% in the adult population and 98% in our oldest age group, those who were between 20 and 24 years. Even in the youngest age group, about 2/3 were mobile phones users. Therefore, there was a lack of unexposed persons, furthering limiting statistical power in our analyses. The study, which started 10 years ago, has so far only resulted in 6 international publications, and the main results paper still is not published. Due to the publishing agreement between the investigators, country results can only be published once the overall results are in press. But the good news is that today the paper which is supposed to answer the main study question, whether young brain cancer patients are more likely exposed to mobile phones than controls, is now under revision and will be published pretty soon. In the meantime, I may comfort you with a recent paper which might already give you an idea about the answer to the research question. In this recent Canadian study, using a different design, trends in cell phone use and glioma, one specific type of brain tumors were not associated. So what can we learn from this study? Well, we learned another design, and the good news is if there is an effect of mobile phone use, at least in the classical way of using it, by holding it close to your head, on brain tumors, it must be rather small. Such small effects are very hard to assess in epidemiological studies. We also learned the importance of good national and international leadership and collaboration in such huge research studies involving many partners. And maybe the most important challenge in assessing health effects of new technology. The technology sometimes develops faster than health sciences may do. With this, I would like to come to the last study question and the last study type. Personally, it's one of my favorite studies and one of the most exciting we are doing from my point of view. It's a cohort study, not only at the vertical level, but also horizontally. It not only takes a lifespan approach, but more in a minute. It not only takes a lifespan approach, but more in a minute. Let's start with the study question and with the question what a cohort study actually is. It's a study following a population over months or years, measuring different exposures and usually focusing on some diseases or group of diseases. However, when it comes to chronic diseases, not only the experience in one's own life seems to be relevant, and that's the idea of the study I'm showing you now. The SOLAR study. Here, our outcome is respiratory health and asthma. And until some years ago, there was big hope that genetics would be the key to the origins of many diseases like asthma and allergies. While genes form the basic of our health and well-being, they can be modified, not only slowly over time and not only by passing genes from parents to children, not only by mutation, but also within across generations by epigenetics. In this graph, we see genes which are shared between generations, in this example, grandparents, parents, and children. Besides the genes, the environment, lifestyle, hormonal factors, microbial diversity in the environment and the body, stress and nutrition influence our health over their lifespan. They might influence whether genes are switched on or off. The switching on and off of genes by environmental factors is called epigenetics. It seems that this switching on and off might be passed from one generation to the other, and even might jump from grandparental generation to the generation of grandchildren. One example for which this was already shown is grandparental smoking and respiratory health of the grandchildren. To study such associations, we followed up a cohort which was recruited by our Children's Hospital and the Children's Hospital in Dresden in the east of Germany in the late 1990s. This recruitment was done within a worldwide study on asthma and allergies in children called ISAC. It started as any cohort as a cross-sectional study. At recruitment, participants were around 10 years old. At that age, environmental and social characteristics were assessed, family health was asked, and information on early life factors was collected. We could identify more than 50% of them in the transient age from school to working life in 2002. They were between 16 and 18 years at that time. Since then, we carry out regular follow-ups, assess environmental exposure, including jobs and respiratory health as the outcome. Since they entered their 20s, we also enrolled their children. Up to now, there are 436 families included in this cohort. As you may imagine, many different study questions can be answered, and I will show you just two results of this study. So the first is taken from a PhD thesis in which my dear colleague Ronald Herrera analyzed the association between greenness and a 500-meter buffer around home. It used data of the parental generation only and took their place of living up to age 22 years into account. The outcome here was not respiratory health, but chronic stress, or better to say, two markers of it: work discontent and work overload. The hypothesis behind is that more green space are better for your health. And this effect seems not only to be that you have better air or better opportunities for exercise. So in this graph, exposure to a marker of greenness called NVDI, or Normalized Density Vegetation Index, is categorized in quartiles. Q1 indicates less greenness, Q4 most greenness. To the left, Data from Munich and Dresden are combined. In the middle, we see the data only for participants from Munich, and to the right, only for Dresden. Overall, we can see that more greenness in the home environment is associated with less work discontent and less work overload. The models are taking into account factors which might disturb, in epidemiology we say confound, the association. These factors are sex, having children, physical activity, education, and so on. The combined model includes almost 1,500 participants. When we separate for city, effect seems a little more pronounced from Munich and even more pronounced for Munich and less for Dresden, especially when we look at the overload. The other example is even newer and is currently under review in a scientific journal. In answer to the question whether exposure at the workplace to irritant or allergic agents of the mother or father might alter the risk of asthma symptoms and allergic skin symptoms called eczema of the next generation, so of their children. Here my colleague Forster applied Bayesian statistics, a form of statistics where we do not longer need to rely on p-values. The results are shown as a distribution centered around an estimate, in this case, again, an odds ratio, the Bayesian odds ratio. Yellow curves are maternal exposure, purple, paternal exposure at the workplace. Very important, this is exposure even before pregnancy. Results are stable when taking pregnancy exposure into account. Potential confounders or disturbers are also taken into account in these models. The upper panel shows the results for symptoms of wheeze as one marker of asthma during the first year of life. If any, the paternal exposure to allergens is associated with wheeze of the offspring. The lower panel, figures C and D, show the results for eczema skin symptoms during the first year of life. Here we see an Bayesian odds ratio above 1 for maternal exposure to allergens and for maternal exposure to irritants. So this gives some indication of an epigenetic effect of exposure at the workplace crossing generational borders. So this gives you some clue on the pleasure of working across generations. However, as you also see, you need a lot of time to carry out such study. Almost 30 years by now. We had the honor that the pediatricians who started the ISAC study in Germany inherited the cohort to us. And we were lucky enough to receive research funds to follow the cohort over the past 20 years. We are even more lucky that we have so many participants motivated enough to still answer our questionnaires and donate blood and do all the physical exams. So even with their children and their spouses. The results are exciting and of a high level of new evidence. What might come next? Well, we have taken exposure into account in our solar study and across solar, but mainly measured it by questioning. The next idea of some famous researchers, including the group of Stefan Brüser-O'Reilly at our institute, is the exposome. The exposome means measuring a set of exposures across the lifespan of an individual. However, it may of course also include more generations. Measurement will always be taken at important time points in life to reflect exposures to keep during key periods like in utero exposure, infancy, during childhood, etc. The question is which exposure should be measured? Here is a list resulting from a recent EU project in which my colleague Stefan Brüser-O'Reilly took part. as a main researcher. The simple thing is the place of residence, the place of living, the location of your house. But at the same time, it's also sensitive personal data. Relatively easy to measure is temperature, light, and UV exposure. It gets more complicated with the noise exposure because humans have the custom to travel around over the day. So noise exposure can be very different, e.g. at night, at home, during the day, commuting, at school, at the workplace, etc. It gets even more complicated when we think about nutrition. Overall, it's an interesting approach to combine all different exposures of the lifespan to characterize the exposome as opposed to the genome, and from this, study its association with health and well-being. With this outlook to potential future directions, I'm coming to the end of today's presentation and would like to summarize. You have learned today that the environmental burden of disease is important to health of the global population. You have also learned that, among others, epidemiologic studies are used to assess the impact of environmental factors on health. We have then discussed different epidemiologic study designs using examples of studies my group at LMU has been involved in. I hope that by doing so, I've shown you that for future studies, we need to learn to leave boundaries behind. We need to think outside the box in international collaborations across generations and across species. For this, we need to learn interdisciplinary thinking. For all this, I think UGLO and eGloria are excellent starting points. With this, I thank you very much for your attention and wish you all the best for the future. Bye-bye.
I would like to hereby thank Professor Katja Radum for this engaging presentation. And as mentioned today, we won't be having a live Q&A session, but if you have any questions left unanswered, you can also type them into the comments section below, and we will forward them to Professor Radum to answer. So with that, we arrive to the end of today's session of the UGLO Open University course, and we are looking forward to be seeing you next week, where the topic will be pandemics and their effects on human history and evolution. I wish you all a very nice evening and hoping to see you next week. Goodbye.